Hey everybody, welcome back to the class. This is week 2 of vry102. My name is Dariush Derkshani, and we're going to be talking about vry 3.0 primarily for Maya. Now this is the scene that we have from last week, and you may recall that we changed the materials for the floor, the walls, and the airplane to vray materials from Mia materials. We still have some stock Maya, Lamberts, and Blins and stuff like that for this little decorative box and also for the lamp. We'll be converting the rest of the scene over to vray lights and materials. We have currently in this scene a rectangle light in vray as well as a vray sphere light to give us this light from the lamp. So we're going to talk a little bit more about materials, and we're also going to introduce the vray light dome and HDR to add in to the scene. At the end of the course, I'll be doing a quick overview of what we talked about here in 3D Studio Max and taking a look at Max's implementation of Maya 3.0 within the same concept. So if you want to skip right ahead, go to the end of the video, but it is going to be an overview, kind of a review. We did it this way in Maya, we're going to do it this way in Max, so it's probably beneficial to watch through and then pick up on the Max if you're only interested in Max, but that's up to you. If there's any questions about this, hit up the forum. There'll be a week 2 thread. So let's go ahead and start. Now, you may recall the mental ray render had a lot more illumination in the scene, and part of the reason why this is a much more moodier lighting is that lights in vray automatically have decay turned on in the light itself. You can, of course, turn decay off, and you would have to reduce your let's go ahead and try it. You'd have to reduce your intensity quite a bit. So if we're at 120, I'm going to go all the way down to, let's say about 4. And let's put this in the buffer. Now the history buffer, make sure your H down here is turned on. And that'll give you your render history. I'm going to go ahead and make sure we're saved in the buffer. It looks like we definitely are. Go ahead and render now with no decay on that rectangle light. And we see immediately that 4 is too high. Let's go back to 1. I hit escape to cancel that. I'm going to restart the render. You see where the mouse goes, my render buckets go. That's because I've got the track button turned on, and that's kind of handy. To refresh, the bottom has a timestamp, which is accessible through this down arrow icon. And then this burns the timestamp on. I'm just going to leave that on so we can see it. And this ends up being a little bit more like the mental ray that we've got from before, the mental ray render, which also had an IBL. So to be fair, we had an HDR filling our scene with more light, but of course the area light we had in mental ray also had decay turned off. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back to our preferred settings with that decay. So we'll have, there we go. So this is our current lighting. We're going to add a dome light in the scene. Now I'm in my working perspective window. I'm going to go to create lights, and I'll go to vray dome light. Now the dome light is pretty similar in its attributes. We've got color mode between color and temperature, so you can change your color, you can change your temperature, whichever mode you like. We're going to be eventually using panoramic HDR on this scene, but for right now I'm going to leave it at 1. By default, the dome light is hemisphere. I'm going to go ahead and render this view so we can see what's going on from afar. And you can see there's the bottom part of our hemisphere. The light is actually visible, and by default it is. As a matter of fact, all lights in V-Ray are on for visibility by default. I'm going to turn the visibility off for my dome light. Now let's go ahead and check this little area to make sure. With the invisible turned on, the light dome won't appear, but of course we'll still get illumination. Now let's make it back over to our camera. Here's our render camera, and I'm going to turn off render regions, and then we'll go ahead and click render up here. That'll reset my render to this current window, and we'll see how this looks. Now, as you can see, there's definitely a lot more illumination in the scene, but there's also a lot more reflecting in the scene as well. The dome light, which now is encompassing the top hemisphere of the scene, is definitely reflecting in our bright box there. So let's take a look. This is what we had before. This is what we currently have with the dome light turned on. We get a lot more illumination. This is controlled by the intensity multiplier. So if we want to get back down a little bit, so we see a little bit more of that mood and a little bit more of the lamp, we'll want to go down probably about to a half, maybe a little bit less than a half, to get the look. The subdivs on a light dome work just like the subdivs on other lights. If you're noticing a lot of this sort of fine grain, that's a subdivs issue. Typically, you want to address it in your overall subdivisions. This is under the V-Ray tab. Right now we have a min and max of 1 and 5, not terribly high. If we go up to about 1 and 16, make sure this is in our buffer, and we'll go ahead and render this. And as you can see, our wall's getting darker, obviously because we have a lower intensity. The noise is mitigated somewhat with this wall back here. It's not terribly different. I'm going to go ahead and hit escape, and we'll take a look at the difference. Now if I just double click here, I'll get to see the image that I've stored in my history buffer, in addition to saving the current render in the next higher up slot. So that is a little bit of a time saver. You can tell that the noise is getting a little bit better now that we moved up to 16. We'd want to lower our threshold to get slightly cleaner. Now let's see what happens if we increase our light dome subdivs. Let's go ahead and select the part of our wall here. And now with a subdiv of 12, I can zoom in a little bit on our frame as soon as we're done. So I'm using the mouse wheel to zoom, and I'm using the middle mouse button. I'm not holding down Alt, just the middle mouse button and then the zoom on the wheel. Take a look. I'm going to double click on our top thumbnail, and that'll save my current render into here. So there is no change between these two renders, even though I've turned up my global samples and my light samples. We're going to be talking about noise mitigation and how to get your grain out a little bit later on. Very quickly, this is more of a threshold issue because this is a gray wall. So don't just jump right into upping your max subdivs or your light subdivs until we get a little better look at noise mitigation. But essentially, I can lower my noise by decreasing my threshold because there's much less of a variation in the color here. We'll talk about that in subsequent classes. You see now it's starting to clean up a little bit, and that grain is starting to go away. But we want faster renders right now. So we'll set this back to the way it used to be, which is 1 in 5, and we'll leave our subdivs at 8. But we'll come back and we'll talk about how to get rid of this noise a little bit later on. But I want you to be aware of what these do. So let's do a full render. We'll get the whole scene rolling here. We're a little bit darker on the dome light, so our point light's getting a nice little kick off of the lampshade. So let's say we're pretty happy with that. The issue is going to be with our little reflective bits. They tend to be a little bit flat because they're reflecting pure white from that hemisphere. Now, it is a hemisphere by default, so if I go ahead and I select my dome light, here it is in the outliner, dome light, I'm going to turn my spherical on. This will give me a full dome all the way around, and will actually increase, go ahead and save that in the buffer, will actually increase the amount of light that we have in our scene overall as well. So here we go, we're a little bit brighter in the scene because of that spherical nature. We've increased the amount of light in our scene because the area we're casting from is larger. Here's a hemisphere, here's the full sphere. So we're getting more light bouncing in. This will be much more useful when we get our HDR on here. Now let's get our conversation back to the topic at hand, which is all about materials. We have this box, which is a Blinn, I believe. Oh, stand corrected. Looks like it's a Fong. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a V-Ray material out of this. This has some displacements, as well as a reflection map, and of course a color map. We'll make our standard V-Ray material. And firstly, I'm going to kind of go in and get that sheen sort of squared away. We want to switch our BDRF to a Fong, get a reflection color up. I'm going to turn Fresnel off for now. And I'm going to reduce my reflection amount quite a bit there. And then reduce my reflection gloss a little bit as well. Let's go with a 0.75. Again, the Fresnel will mitigate the reflections in facing angles and increase the reflection in the glancing angles around the subject. We'll leave it off for right now. We're going to go ahead and put it on our box. Now, mapping is pretty much the same in V-Ray materials. I'm going to go ahead and add that in there. Let's take a look at the material here we've got for the box. Call this decorative box material. And the opacity obviously will make this more or less invisible. This would not be used, the opacity map would not be used necessarily for glass. For glass, you're going to want to use a refraction color. And this is something we will try out a little later on. We're going to import some glass objects and make a glass material. But definitely you would not be using opacity map for that. Opacity map you'd be using to cut things out like leaves, outlines, things like that for cards, and not so much for making things like glass. Self-illumination is essentially like incandescence, and will allow this object to essentially create some illumination, have some brightness coming from it. Although there are definitely better ways to create object lights in V-Ray. We'll be looking at those later on. But this guy is pretty glassy right now. One of the things we had on the old Fong was a reflection map that attempted to carve away the parts of the box that are carved so there's no reflection inside them. So we're going to put that into our material by attaching it to either the reflection color or the amount. Now, seeing as this is amount of reflection, I'm going to put it on the amount. Now, if we take a look at the connection, we see that the box detail is outputting its alpha channel into the reflection amount. So for us to control the overall reflection being passed on from this map to the reflection of the material, we're going to want to use alpha gain. So the lower this number, the less reflectivity we'll have on it. You can see the higher it goes, the more reflective this will get. Let's try it on for size. We had a 0.4 alpha gain in here, which should limit our reflections to 0.4 at the highest, and of course the dark areas will be down to about black. Let's render this view real quick. And you can see that the reflectivity of the box is knocked back inside the grooves of the box. We don't have the displacement map working inside here yet. That'll be our next goal. Now, as you can see here in the hypershade, we have an existing displacement map going to our Fong, which we will replicate, or at least get onto our V-Ray material. Very much the same way as in Maya, you can go ahead and middle mouse button click over and select displacement map. And what that will do is it'll create, just like with regular Maya shaders, it'll create a displacement node that is attached to the shading node. There's no direct connection between these two nodes, just like with Maya doesn't connect to the Fong directly, goes to the shading group node. There's another way of doing displacements. We'll take a look at that in a moment, but let's get the box and we'll do a quick render with this displacement. Now, while this is rendering, we are going to be able to take a look and use Maya somewhat functionally, and our displacement has an alpha gain of negative 0.015 already set on it. That's to make sure that the displacement goes into the box, and we can see we're getting carvings in the box. So the displacement at a 1-to-1 ratio works great. So the same displacement that'll give me this effect in Mental Ray is doing the same thing for me with V-Ray. that's when you're going through the shading group, which I just did just then. Now, when we go and take a look at the history, we can see our displacements are working just fine. Now, another way to do displacements in VRay is to add a displacement node to the object itself. Right now, we are doing a displacement through the shading group, through the shader, which is sort of Maya's way of doing it. I'm going to delete that. Now, just to check, I'm going to turn on my render region and make sure that I've deleted the displacement node, and there's no shenanigans going on here. And we can see that displacement is indeed gone. Here we'll see if we want to check against the buffer. Okay, so displacement's gone. That's great. I'm going to add a vray displacement through create vray displacement. This way you can add the same displacement to a number of objects, and it also puts the displacement on a node attached to the geometry. It's actually through a set in Maya. And that allows you to have the same sort of displacement on an object no matter what shader or material it has applied to it, which is really very handy. I'm going to apply a single vray displacement node to my selection. Nothing really comes up because it's not shader based, but if we take a look in our outliner, we can see that there's a new set node called vray displacement. And here's our attribute editor. This is where you slug in your displacement map. I will middle mouse button drag my displacement map over to this attribute. And let's turn this off and render the whole frame. Now you'll see as my render starts resolving itself that it's getting kind of weird. The technical term for it is janky or foobar. What's happening is the displacement is sticking out. So instead of representing grooves or carvings, the box is really kind of exploding out. As you can see, we have a rather spiky box. Well, we're using the same texture as before, but now it's completely messed up. Well, if you do it through the shader, you have to set your alpha gain to control which way and how much the displacement travels when you have a map like this, which is white on black. Because this is going through our vray displacement, our texture does not pay attention to the alpha gain, so we have to do it through the color gain. So I need to adjust my value for my color gain to negative 0.015 to have the same value as I had determined for my alpha gain. So my color gain now matches my alpha gain. This doesn't do anything anymore because we're going through the displacement node. Let's try. Let's put this in our buffer. Let's go ahead and try rendering again. You can see immediately that it's going in the right direction and it's going in the correct amount. We'll check that against our render once we have the full frame. And as the render completes, it looks like it's supposed to. And when we compare it to our previous render, we see that it is pretty exactly the same, with a very minor time savings of about 1 second. But we have the same exact outcome. The difference being, now I can attach this displacement to any other object in my scene simply by adding it to my set here. And it can have a completely different material, but still have that displacement. It's very handy for when you're doing some matte work, because your displacement could be trumped when you change your shader in the old Maya way of doing things when you're dealing with a shading node. But now, since it's on the object, you can swap out the color and the shader entirely and still not lose that displacement. Very handy when you're doing a lot of render layers. That way you can keep that displacement on the object, but give it some sort of black box or black hole shader to your heart's content. Now, with the displacement node that we have here, there also is displacement control. In the render settings, under the settings tab, you've got default displacement subdivision control, and this is on a global basis where you can set a global edge length, max subdivs, and an amount. Edge length and max subdivs work towards the quality of the displacement, where edge length is lower values for higher quality. Max subdivs is the number of subdivisions that will occur to the geometry to get the displacement to show up. It's not advised to have this be a very high number. The V-Ray recommends that you increase the tessellation on the geometry itself as opposed to increasing the max subdivs. And 256 max subdivs is actually pretty good. I wouldn't really go any higher than that. I would actually work to make this number a little bit lower. The quality really lies in the edge length, and how well some of these lines and carvings come out will be more affected by edge length, but that will drastically increase render times as well. We'll take a look at doing this, but we don't need to do it on a global basis because we can also do it on an object basis. To illustrate that point, I'm going to make a plane that I'm going to put into place right next to our box. We'll make it about the same size as the lid on our box. We'll get it into place here. And I'm going to put the same exact displacement on this without changing its material. Okay, so here we go. I will go in and I'm going to give it just a regular V-Ray material that has some reflection on it. Go ahead and assign it to this simple V-Ray material. I want to make sure, since this has a particular UV space, that my UVs for this new plane are about the same size as what the lid of the box will be, give or take. We'll get in close on here, and what I'll do with my displacement is I'm going to go ahead and take my color gain to a positive number. We'll go to about 0.3. That way we'll see these carvings actually sticking up. Just to illustrate this point, I have not attached the displacement yet. I'm going to go ahead and render this frame really quick so we can see the flat gray plane next to our box. And when I have this rendered, we have the flat plane next to our kind of a spiky box. All our carvings are sticking out. To add the same displacement, all I need to do is take our plane and with the middle mouse button drag it over to this set, which gives us this displacement. And if I want to go in and render this part out, I can check to make sure that the displacement is showing up on our box. So two different materials, but the same displacement. Okay, so now we have this low tessellation, single polygon face plane with a much more tessellated box object with the same displacement. Now, the global settings are all up here, but we can have object-specific settings as well. Now that my plane is part of this V-Ray displacement, I can go into the attribute editor for that object, and under attributes, V-Ray, I'm going to add subdivision and displacement quality, and that gives me extra V-Ray attributes for this object. So I'm not reliant on the global render settings for this one object. You can see it's already checked to override the global settings. So I could increase or decrease any of these. So with a max subdivs of 4 and an edge length of 4 for one object, but then the global settings for the other object. So what I'll do here is I'll set my max subdivs to match my global, so it has the same max divs as my box and as its previous render. I'll set my edge length to 1. I'll go ahead and render this region. We'll see how the edge length will affect the quality of my displacement. So with the subdivs at the same number as before, we can see an appreciable difference in the quality of that displacement. My lines are cleaner, the inside of my lines, the inside of the grooves are cleaner, and I really didn't take a hit in the render time for that region at all. Going the opposite way and increasing your edge length, let's go to 16 for my edge length, where before, here's an edge length of 4. This is an edge length of 1. Let's see what happens with an edge length of 16, which is quite high and should give us a less than desirable displacement. But it should save us a little time, perhaps. And we can see with a higher edge length, we save on the render time, but we lose quite a bit of quality. Here we are with an edge length of 1 compared to 16. So we have an appreciable 4-second gain in speed, but our displacement doesn't look very good. So we'll go back to our edge length of 1, and we can start reducing the max subdivs if you want to save a little bit of time. But going too far down will end up changing the quality, changing the tenor of your displacement. So I've reduced my max subdivs to 128. We'll render and see what this looks like compared to before. So here we are with half our max subdivs compared to what we had before, with a subdivs of 256. So let's see, we've got 256 subdivs, edge length of 1 here, and there's no real change. Time is within about a second. Let's get rid of this image. So we're looking at these two. No real difference. A little bit extra time, but that's within margin of error, I'm sure. But if we go too low, let's go to ridiculously low max subdivs of just 1. Especially with a single face, it's not going to have a whole lot of tessellation. So our grooves are going to end up being much thinner, much more shallow, and we lose the real depth of that, and the real quality of that. So you don't want to go too low on the max subdivs, but you definitely do not want to go too high on max subdivs either. It's better to tessellate the geometry than to have a ridiculous number for max subdivs. So I think our sweet spot for this guy is edge length of 1 with a max subdivs of about 128. This, of course, overrides our render settings, our global settings. We could do this for the box as well. You can see I already have quite a bit of tessellation around the outsides, not a whole lot on the insides. So the max subdivisions is really coming into play more here. It looks like we could definitely use some edge length. So again, we'll go to our attributes for that object, vray, and we're going to add subdivision and displacement quality. Under extra vray attributes, set our edge length down to 1. Now, by default, adding this on a per object basis gives you a max subdivs of 4. I think that's going to be okay for our box. Let's go ahead and render the box out and see what max subdivs of 4 will get us. And as you can see, there's really not much of a difference. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel my render and we'll compare the two. We'll see we've got a little bit more noise going on. So I think we're going to need slightly higher max subdivs. So let's go to 16. And you're going to want to find the lowest number that'll give you the best. Same thing with the edge length. Matter of fact, I'm going to reduce my edge length even more for higher quality. And I'll go to 32 on my max subdivs for this object. And as you can see, our render is moving pretty slow, but in this area, which has been completed by now, our lines are much cleaner for the displacement. So the edge length being at 0.5 is really helping this sort of craggly curves resolve into much smoother curves. But it does come at a higher render time. So with our render finished, you can really appreciate the edge length making such a quality difference. Here we are before, here we are after. It's a very night and day difference with the edge length. This is an edge length of 4 versus an edge length of 0.5. However, our render time for this region went from 44 seconds up to 7 minutes 26 seconds. So you want to use edge length sparingly. And in short, you want to try to get away with the highest number possible for edge length to achieve the quality that you desire. And you want to achieve that with the lowest max subdivs that you can get and still get the quality that you need. So with a 7.5 minute render, our edge length is really too low for that render time. So with an edge length of 4, that's unacceptable in quality at 44 seconds. We'll probably be able to get a really good result with about an edge length of 1 with only a couple of minutes for that region. And we'll be able to get fairly close to this quality without that much of render time. In addition to edge length and max subdivs, which again were added on a per object basis through subdivision and displacement control, there's an additional displacement control that adds a bunch of new vray attributes to that object. The most notable is the displacement amount. This ends up being a factor that basically multiplies how much displacement is going on, with 0 essentially turning off your displacement and -1 essentially pushing your displacement back in. So if we want, we can do a positive 0.5 and we'll get half of that raising. And that will look like this is our output. Displacement amount is half, and we have our new edge length. And that was barely 2 minutes, 1 minute 52 seconds. And we have a pretty nice render, which is controlled in quality as well as quantity by changing the amount and setting our edge length from 0.5 to 1. Big time difference, and the quality level is still quite good. Furthermore, you can set your type of displacement, normal, 2D, and also vector displacements through this control. Now, let's shift focus to water level, and we're going to be looking at it on this plane. So I'm going to adjust my render region. We have an edge length of 1, max subdivs of 128. Let's render this at its base before we get into the water level and see what this looks like. So here's our existing. What we're going to do is we're going to add the displacement control to this plane. Leave everything the same. Make sure that this is in our buffer. And we're going to turn on water level. I'm going to set a modest 0.1. And what water level allows us to do is basically clip the geometry according to the height of the displacement. And as you can see, the very bottom part of this geometry is essentially clipped out, and only the parts of the geometry that are at 0.1 unit in displacement above the original normal will be visible, essentially clipping the geometry, allowing you to make a pretty cool little lattice work using a simple displacement map with simple geometry. The higher the water level, the greater your displacement has to be to keep any of that lattice work in place. Now, let's get back to our box here. Make sure we have our displacement settings back the way we wanted them. So our color gain should be negative 0.015 to get the grooves in the way we want. Of course, that number may change according to how close you are to the box when you're rendering it. So it's really dependent on your distance here. So if we're rendering from about this distance, that color gain of negative 0.015 will give us the grooves we're looking for. Additionally, we also turned on a pretty decent edge length and max subdivisions for a good quality on that box that we saw. So we'll keep those settings. I'll do a quick render of this scene. Turn off regions, and we'll take a look at how the box is before we continue with the rest of the scene. And as the render progresses, I'm going to hit escape to cancel it because I'm not really happy with the displacements quite yet. They're not quite deep enough. I seem to have forgotten to change my displacement amount to 1. Let's put this in the buffer and take a look at what these displacements are going to look like with our amount set back to 1. So I should be getting the full negative 0.015 depth in my displacement. Seeing as my color gain was negative, that's what makes it push in. Now I could run it through here, keep my color gain at white, so there's no change in the color gain, but do all my displacement amount through the actual vray attribute added to the object. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at what that's going to look like. So we'll go back here, we'll reset my color gain back to 1, and if you remember, what this will do is it'll make, I'll even set my alpha gain reset back to 1 just for clarity's sake. If you recall, doing so will create my displacement sticking out, which is exactly what I don't want. But now I'm handing over the control of my displacement amount directly to the vray attributes and taking them away from the color gain of the texture itself, which is sort of traditionally how you would do it in Maya, old school way. So this is garbage. We don't like this. We're going to hit escape to get out. So instead of that, we're controlling all of our displacements through here, and I'll do negative 0.015, and we should get the same displacement as what I've saved in the buffer, which is having a negative 0.15 on the color gain. As soon as this is done, we'll compare the frames. And here we are comparing with color gain versus displacement amount. This is my color gain at negative 0.15 with an amount of 1, and this is my color gain set at 1, or white, with my displacement amount of a negative 0.015. This is the preferred way to do it. All your controls are on a per object basis and not a per texture basis, giving you ultimate control to have different amounts on one object that has the same exact texture on another object, which will have its own extra vray attributes for displacement control. Now, why did I show it both ways? Well, this is the old school way of doing things by controlling color or alpha gain to control displacement. So it's a lot easier to use the displacement control found in the extra vray attributes. Displacement shift will add a base number to your displacement for your object. So now I'm going to be adding a full displacement of 1 to my box, which is not going to look right. It'll make the box look bigger than it should be, but it's just basically an offset. It's just basically a shift number. You see how the box is being displaced about 1.011 units out, and yeah, that's really no good. So we're going to put the shift back down to 0. This is helpful if you need to enlarge or shrink your object a little bit. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the depth of my grooves by 0.3. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and we'll take a look at a full render of this box with our displacements as is. And then we'll evaluate the reflections that we see and get an HDR on the dome so we get some better reflections. And here we are with a deeper crevice for our etchings and our box. Now, the reflection isn't, terribly nice. It's pretty much just a white dome. What I'm going to do for this view in my camera, I'm going to go ahead and set a bookmark so I can come back to this view. We are out here. We'll open up the outliner and take a look at our light dome. Right now our light color is white. You would think you'd want to put a texture on the light color, but there's no mapping ability. Actually, what you have to do is down in the texture area, you have to turn on use dome text. And here you can put in a map. I'm going to go ahead and use a file node, and I will go to load the file livingroom.panoramic.hdr, which you'll find in the source images folder for the project that you downloaded in week 1. And this will give us this HDR. So my primary light is coming through this window. It's not a whole lot of light. It's coming in right behind us. So to adjust the orientation of this, I can try to select my light dome and orient it, but you'll see that it doesn't affect the HDR. Instead, what you need to do is you need to find the tab in the attribute editor called Place Environment Texture 1. This is attached to your object as soon as you put that file node on your light dome. See, there's a checkbox for Use Transform here. And when it's turned on, what it allows you to do is use the orientation of the light dome to dictate the orientation of your HDR. So if we put the sun right behind our camera, give or take, and also turn it this way if we want, we'll just leave it at the horizon as is. This is a spherical map. We'll check the light dome and make sure that we've got the dome spherical turned on. If we don't, we won't get the bottom, certainly. So we want to make sure the dome spherical is turned on. And let's go to our bookmark for the camera. And we'll render this out. Put this in our buffer. Now, as you can see, our illumination is going to be different because whereas before we had an environment that was pure white, now we have an environment with an HDR, with a sun coming in through the window. And as you can see, that sun is creating a different lighting, which is casting a shadow from our airplane all the way onto our box. This is going to give us a more natural light because the HDR has feature and detail to it, whereas having just a pure sphere light with a light color of white essentially gives me sort of like an ambient light. I don't want to say it's exactly like an ambient light because it isn't, but it gives me an overall white light, which isn't really what happens in real life. So now this box is looking a little less CG than it did before because it's actually being lit by an environment. So a lot of its color is back and you don't have this pure white reflection everywhere. So let's go back out to our render cam and take a look at what our render would be with this IBL. Here we have our previous render with the pure white light dome. Let's take a good look at that. And now let's render this guy with our HDR in place. And because of that detail in the environment on our HDR for the light dome, it's starting to look a little bit nicer than it did before. And here we go. Here's before and here's after. We get quite a bit better looking lighting. Once we get into the lamp in the next class, we'll be taking a look at metal materials as well as glass materials and how all these work together. Now you can try any sort of HDR that you'd like on the light dome. They're very easy to swap in and out. And keep in mind, to orient it, you want to be in the place environment texture and just turn on use transform and you can rotate at will. Much better doing it that way than attempting to put in horizontal and vertical rotations manually through the node itself. Just use the transforms. So again, as a recap, we took a look at adding an HDR to our light dome. We also took a very good look at displacements, displacement control, and quality as well. Next week, we'll take a look at finishing the lamp, creating some materials that are reflective for metal, as well as adding a couple of glass objects to get some refractive materials into our scene. Thanks a lot for attending the second week of vry102. Hope you had a good time. Enjoy yourself, and use this scene to go ahead and create your own box with displacements and your own lighting with an HDR. Now, here is our scene in 3D Studio Max. We're going to be putting a dome light in, as well as converting the textures for our decorative box. To create a dome light in 3ds Max, go to Create, Lights, V-Ray, and we can do V-Ray Dome Light right here. Switch this to Dome, and you're all set. Drag on your interface to create the light. So we have our 3 lights here. Area light, our sphere light for the lamp, and now our dome light. Now the dome light, you can see, has the same color temperature selections. We're going to turn the light invisible, just like we did in Maya. And we will render this out from our camera to see what it looks like. And you'll notice as we finish up that there's quite a bit more illumination in the scene. To turn the light into being a full sphere, you'll want to turn on spherical down here under dome light options, and let's save this to our buffer and re-render to see if there's any illumination change. Due to this being spherical, just like with Maya, it does cast more light because there's more surface area. Of course, we have done nothing with the materials for the lamp yet, so disregard that black lampshade. But you'll notice that particularly up here, we get a lot more light from the spherical nature of the light dome. Now, let's go in and take a closer look at our box. When we render this out with the existing shader network, this is what we get. Just take a look at the materials for this guy. You'll see we have a standard material. There's a diffuse color, same as with Maya. We've got ray traced reflections with a map to take the reflections out of the carvings, again, just like with Maya. And we've got a displacement map coming in, just like with the Maya scene. Now let's create a V-Ray material. We'll go ahead and connect our diffuse map. We already have ray tracing for reflections. We just have to turn on the amount of color, or I should say the amount of reflection. So now this will be a reflective surface. We can feed our reflection map directly into it. Let's take a look at it. Let's assign the material, and let's take a look at the box with full reflectivity and currently no displacement. But this is with the V-Ray material. As you can see, it's reflecting the entire white dome right now. Looks rather flat. Put this in our buffer. We'll grab that reflection and we'll want to put it into our reflection color. See, there we go. We connected that map. Now, by all accounts, the reflections inside the carvings should be all gone. And they are. You can, of course, further control the amount of reflection by going down to the bottom under Maps and adjusting the amount of reflection overall. We'll just leave it at 100% for now. Next order of business is to get this bump map on here. And I could just put the map on displacement. Let's get this into our buffer and render this out, simply adding it to the displacement parameter for the V-Ray material. See that we've got these crazy spikes. Go ahead and cancel the render. And we can make adjustments in our bitmap under output to reduce the amount, or we could do it in the maps section under displace to again reduce the overall amount of that bump. But honestly, the best way to go, and for the most options, is not to feed it through the material itself. In Maya, what we did is we created a V-Ray displacement node, which created a set, and our geometry was part of that set in Maya. With 3ds Max, the difference is you have to add a modifier. So we're going to go to Modifiers, V-Ray. I'm going to add a V-Ray displacement mod. In here, I'm going to attach my map, which is my box detail here. I'm just going to grab my output and drop it on text map as, go ahead and do it as an instance. And we've disconnected it from the material. Let's go ahead and render this. We should get something not great. As you can see, our result is kind of messy. It's very spiky. It's quite a lot of displacement. It's clearly throwing things away from the surface. I'm going to hit escape to stop that. Now, the modifier itself has all of the controls that you need, including the displacement control and the subdivision quality that we had in the attributes that we manually added in Maya. In V-Ray, they're all part of that V-Ray displacement modifier already. So the first thing I'm going to do is my amount. I want this stuff to basically carve into the box. I'm going to go negative, but I only want it to go a little bit. So I'm going to do 0.05. And we'll render the box out, and we'll see that using the V-Ray displacement modifier, we're able to control the amount of displacement and the direction of displacement that we want very easily. No need to go in and try to invert the map or change its color mapping curves or anything like that. So that's working out great. We didn't adjust anything on the map that's been attached. And down here, we've got our edge length, our max subdivs. So I'm going to go ahead and go to an edge length of 1. I will save this guy into our buffer, so we have it for comparison's sake. And then we're going to go to an edge length of 1, which should, in the same way as it did in Maya, increase the quality of the displacement itself and the clarity of the lines. But it will, just like with Maya, take more time the lower that edge length becomes. So be aware of that, but as you can see, especially around here in the buckets that have resolved, and this one that just resolved, it's a much cleaner line, much cleaner. And here's the edge length of 1 render. If we want, we can, of course, put in our frame stamp. Want to click this to put in our render time. Just copy that to the stamp. There we go. There's our render time. And lastly, in our 3ds Max addendum, we're going to add an HDR image to our light dome, just like we did with Maya. So here's my light dome, and I could go in into the modify panel and take a look. We've got color and all that, but if you recall from the Maya implementation, there's a texture location. And what you have to do is make sure you use textures turned on, and then you're going to want to create a texture node that pops in here. You could always go to the standard bitmap, but I prefer to do V-Ray HDR. I'm going to go through the Slate material editor instead. And if you can see under maps, under V-Ray, there's the V-Ray HDRI. I'm going to go in here. Seems to be the safest way for me to do this and have access to my node. I'm going to grab my output slot and pull it into my texture and use instance. And now my HDRI node or texture is attached to my dome. If I double click that, I get access to the parameters. And I can go to my source images, and there's my living room panoramic HDR. So there we have it put in, but you're not really seeing it in the environment, which is unfortunate. We want to preview this in our environment. So under the rendering menu, I'll click on environment. And then just simply drag your output socket from your HDR map over to your environment map. Make sure you use instance because you want this same map to control both the environment as well as the dome light, because the orientation is quite important. So we have that in our environment. Now we have to adjust our viewport. So we'll go to the little plus sign, configure viewports, and in here for the background, we need to switch to use environment background and apply to active view. Now we can see that the mapping doesn't look quite right for this. So in the HDRI, let's change it to spherical mapping. And there we go. Now, here's a render with the HDRI in place. I'm going to select my rectangle light. I'm going to turn it off for the meantime so we can get a render with mostly just the HDRI. We still have the little sphere light in there, but this is our HDR from the dome light. Now, if I select my dome light and I go to orient, I can rotate. Let's see, we're at. To rotate around, you see that the environment doesn't change. But when I render the scene, the lighting will change because the HDRI orientation for the dome light has changed. Let's go ahead and undo our rotation for the dome so we're back to the light we had originally. What you want to do, if you want to sync up the environment so you can really see what's going on inside your viewport, if you want to sync up the environment rotation with the orientation of the light, select the light and in the texture area, turn off lock to dome orientation. This is a safety measure, so if you do rotate the light, it does not rotate the HDR that you have on it. Instead, you'll want to control the orientation of the HDR through the HDR texture itself. Under the mapping section, you'll want to use the horizontal rotation to move the environment. This will in turn, because the same exact texture slot is feeding into both the light dome and the environment, this will also change the light dome's orientation. So if this is our lighting, I've now reoriented the environment, but in doing so, I've also reoriented the HDR map for the dome light as well. So in this manner, you're able to sync up the orientation in the environment that you see in your viewport along with the actual environment for the dome light itself. And that, in a nutshell, is how to accomplish the Week 2 classes work in 3ds Max. If you want some more details on a lot of the different parameters or attributes that I talk about for the materials and the things that I've done, you'll want to go back into the Maya portion of the video and get the details from there. But this is how you would do those actions here in 3ds Max. We'll see you next week.